Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvellous video. Berserk is a story that is filled with many colourful characters, all of whose stories are interwoven by the grand cosmic idea of fate, which is called causality in the series. Every personality you see in Berserk is the service of both their own story and the grander narrative of Guts' struggles against Griffith. But in amongst all the Sonyas, Gennins and Rodericks of the story, the one thing that gets overlooked in our opinion are the many magical creatures of Berserk. Up until the third arc of the story, we weren't even sure if magic was a part of the series, because it started as a hard fantasy story in the Black Swordsman arc, but then turned into a soft fantasy dystopia by the time the Golden Age rolled around. We'd seen things like witches predicting Rickart's fate by reading the star alignments on their crystal balls, and we've had Puck with us since the beginning of the story, but it was only during the Millennium Falcon arc that we learned that there was far more to magical creatures than we could have imagined. Let us know which one of these creatures you didn't spot in the series in the comments down below, because this is every magical creature in Berserk explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Apostles. When we first saw Guts in the series, he was knee-deep in some apostle gushy, and we didn't even know his partner was a monster until she grabbed his metal arm with her clawed arm. The next apostle we saw was the Snake Baron, and he was just sort of a light introduction to the brutal and debased nature of apostles in general. This guy wanted to eat humans, and he wanted his humans served to him the day before yesterday, or he'll go out there and take his meals by force with his serpentine form and his vulva-esque face within a face. Snake Baron was a good reference point for just how ruthless and remorseless apostles can be, and his successor, the Slug Count, is a good reference point for how remorseful and human apostles can be. Because that's what apostles are, in essence. They're human beings who, by sheer chance or a stroke of fate, come across an astral artifact known as a behelit. This behelit, if it belongs to them, can grant them inhuman powers as demonic reincarnates, but only at the small cost of having the users sacrifice the people who define their humanity and tethering their soul to Berserk's version of hell itself. Some of you might be wondering why apostles are on a list of magical Berserk creatures, but the fact is that their existence is fueled by an arcane existence. When a human being activates their behelits, it opens a fissure in their astral bodies which is pumped with the evil essence of the idea of evil, transforming them into the monsters we love to hate. Apostles are amongst the vilest of magical beings in Berserk because, as Diber explains, their very existence is an abomination to mankind. Apostles exist to hate and be hated, kill and be killed. Over the course of Berserk's 1,000-year history, many apostles have terrorized the world, but not all of them are full-blown, bloodthirsty, rapacious savages. Some of them were warriors of great renown during their time as humans, like Grunbeld, the Flame Dragon Knight, or Sir Locus, the Moonlight Knight. But despite their seemingly righteous lifetimes as human beings, they ended up becoming servants to the idea of evil. This shows that causality doesn't just favor those who are willing to embrace their darkness, it can also sniff out the malice lurking within the hearts of good men and then exploit it to further its own agenda. Whatever be the case for your reincarnation, once you become an apostle, your soul is guaranteed a one-way trip to the abyss. So, if you want to reap the benefits of being one of the strongest magical creatures in Berserk, you have to move quick and pray to the Godhand that Guts doesn't find you in some dark forest one lonesome night. Elves. Sorry to burn you out with all that demonic sacrificial business. We want to lighten the mood a bit, and what better way to do that by talking about the resident mischief makers of Berserk, the Elves. We're introduced to Elves in the very first chapter of Berserk when Guts saves Puck from a gang of thugs working for the Snake Baron, when he really was just looking to start a fight. Saving Puck was incidental. However, that incident gave birth to what is quite possibly the only relationship responsible for keeping Guts on his own 2 feet. When we think of elves, our mind usually goes in one of 2 directions. It's either the human-sized race of paler than vampire elves, whose magical powers are unrivaled in the cosmos, like the elves from Lord of the Rings, or they're tiny little troublemakers that are one helpful activity away from being a brownie if you're watching this video from somewhere in the UK. Miora's elves are different in that they're a cross between these two and the Highland Pixie, a type of fairy whose actions are quite reminiscent of an elf if you read up on them. Miora's elves are just as playful and mischievous as you'd expect them to be if you're into elfin folklore. They're brash, boastful, have the visual memory of a goldfish, and are prone to stirring the pot and ruining people's days quite literally. Just ask any witch from Elfhelm. But despite their rambunctious nature, elves are one of the best magical creatures in all of Berserk. Their wings can produce a substance called elf dust, which can heal all physical wounds at an inhuman pace. When Guts came out of the eclipse, he was covered in cuts all over, missing an arm and an eye, and prone to bleeding out if things weren't taken care of immediately. A few pinches of elf dust, and his wounds might as well have never existed. Had it not been for his handicaps, it would be difficult to distinguish Guts pre- and post-eclipse. The fact he's had Puck with him since day one is the main reason he's still alive, though Guts would never openly admit it, and he'd rather be caught dead before admitting that Puck has saved his life at least twice, once by using his signature Puck Spark. But what's more impressive about the Elves is that they can sense a person's emotions, and that's key because this was the reason Puck worked so well as a character in the early stages of Berserk. His empathy balanced out Guts' malignant edginess and gave us an emotional balance that most readers feel the series has lost since Puck became Chestnut Puck. But we think his insistence on teaching Isidro, even the straight-laced and haughty female pixie Evilera, who is Shurkei's constant companion, gets up to a bit of naughtiness when she's in the mood for it, and that's why elves rule. Incubi. These little floating bastards would either be H.P. Lovecraft's favourite little spirit creatures, or a reason why a protagonist of his goes crazy in one of his many lunatic-obsessed stories. Incubi look like a cross between a mini octopus and a cyclops, except its powers will remind you of Cthulhu. Born of the mixture of the blood and sexual fluids of a person who died with a heart filled with hatred and malice, these seemingly harmless beasts can induce terrible nightmares in their targets if they're left unchecked. We get a first-hand account of this when Guts, in just the second chapter of Berserk, falls prey to an Incubi attack where he's chased down by his own demon child down a corridor that looks a lot like the sewers of Midland, which Guts and co. used to escape with Griffith during the Griffith rescue mission. The only reason he snaps out of it is because he's had enough experience dealing with these things to know which nightmares are his and which ones are being induced. He stabs the Incubi off himself, does the same for the one that crawls all over Puck, and then proceeds to fight through a massive horde of skeletal warriors that have been reanimated by the malignant souls of the restless dead. Guts manages to survive, obviously. He's the Black Swordsman for a reason. But the Incubi also give us a hint that initially, Miura was probably going to have Berserk feature in a hard fantasy setting. In the first chapter of Berserk, titled The Black Swordsman, people treat Puck's existence as a normal thing, which is quite bizarre considering that spotting an elf is supposed to be as common as surviving cancer in the Middle Ages, which is to say, next to impossible. Guts is able to pretty efficiently explain the nature of an Incubi to the wagon driver who gave him a lift in the Prelude arc, which is another hint that Berserk switched from a hard to a soft fantasy setting because his knowledge of the astral world and its actual workings has been shown to be limited in the rest of this series. The Incubi themselves only prominently resurface in the story when the Black Swordsman party enters Astral World's region of darkness, Cliffoth, where they dot the skies like so many flies, and that one time Puck failed to keep guard over Guts as he rested on his way to St. Albion. But to be honest with you, that's probably for the best, considering how disturbing things get when they do show up. And speaking of disturbing, dead spirits. The biggest question for many of us in life is probably this: what happens to us when we die? Do we go to heaven? Hell? Are we reincarnated as flowers? Or do we just live where we died? Bitter and angry and grievously greedy for the warmth of life to pass us by so we can snuff it out by possessing it. Everyone loves a good ghost story, but if you're a soul that didn't die at peace in Kentaro Miura's world, that last bit was tailor-made for you. Berserk doesn't waste a lot of time in showing us the result of a human being dying in any other way than the intended way. When a human being dies with regrets and rage in their hearts, their spirits do not pass away. Instead, it ends up lingering where the death took place, residing in a shallow layer of the astral world known as the interstice. Usually, such a spirit should not be able to affect a human being because at the time they were introduced, the physical and astral worlds were entirely different. But for any human that was in the vicinity of Guts, the story too was entirely different. As one who carried the brand of sacrifice, Guts was a walking target for many malign astral creatures, and the foremost of those were these formless spirits with hideous, tortured faces. Once the dead spirits had caught scent of Guts' brand, they would try to do anything in order to acquire his body, including attacking him head-on, possessing other organic life forms around him like dogs, corpses, skeletons, and in one particular case, Farnace. Or they try to take over his body directly. That last tactic doesn't work usually because Guts always has his guard all the way up, but on the rare occasion that a dead spirit does manage to trap him, he has to resort to things like firing off a cannon shot from his fake arm to break himself out of their spell. And because the geography of the world is always changing, there's absolutely no shortage of the number of dead spirits that Guts can encounter, no matter where he goes without astral protection. Think about it. The very ground your house is built upon right now could have been the site of a mass grave 1,000 years ago. And so if Guts were to walk into your house right now, he'd be the worst house guest ever because he'd just end up opening you and family up to spiritual possession. These dead spirits get even stronger when an event like the eclipse or the incarnation ceremony is coming around the corner, and we see this fact with our eyes during the latter thanks to the blood flow of the dead. We'll talk about that in another video though, because we've got a lot of creatures to get through here, and this is just our 4th entry. Pseudo Apostles. Every great evil monster has to have evil minions that they can control telepathically and are also bound to their will. Pseudo Apostles serve the minion role for apostles in Berserk. Not every apostle has the power to create their own army of artificial apostle underlings, because so far we've only seen 3 apostles in the story possess the power to create their own demonic warriors. But if you happen to be one of those 3 apostles, then your daily routine of making human lives a living nightmare was a lot easier thanks to these guys. A pseudo apostle is created when an apostle shares the essence of evil that powers their bodies with another individual via biological means. The Slug Count, for example, created his pseudo Zondark by making the guy swallow a slug-like entity with the Count's face, which acted like a parasite that made Zondark the Count's running man. Rosine incubated her elfin pseudos in cocoons, which were used for her personal connection to the Abyss to transform children into murder elves. The Egg of the Perfect World used its stingers to inject the essence of evil into his targets, like the Great Goat and Father Mosgus and his disciples. In each case, the creation process was varied, but the outcome was the same. The power of a pseudo-apostle depends upon the purpose for which they were created. Slug Count and Rosine pseudos were certainly powerful, and in the latter case also plentiful, but they weren't strong enough to be more than a hindrance to his journey. The Great Goat and Father Mosgus, on the other hand, might as well have been full-fleshed apostles, given the insane amount of strength and durability they possessed. A pseudo-apostle doesn't necessarily have to be aware of the fact that it's a pawn in someone else's game, as both the Great Goat and Father Mosgus weren't aware of just what happened to give them their powers. They just accepted it, and went along with the Egg of the Perfect World's machinations unintentionally by causing even more violence and bloodshed in St. Albion, which is what was needed for the Egg to trigger the incarnation ceremony. Pseudo Zondark gave Guts a good run for his money the first time they fought each other, and the less we talk about those murder elves and their insectoid guardians from the Lost Children arc, the better it would be for all of us. Curiously enough, though a pseudo is not created by a behelit, their souls seem to also end up in the Abyss after their deaths, as every pseudo-apostle Guts slays reverts to their human form after the fact. Still, the thought that there might just be some people within Griffith's current band of the Falcon that can spawn their own mini-armies of hideous human-eating monsters sends a chill down our spine, as it should yours. But speaking of Griffith, Godhand. Arguably the strongest canonical astral beings in all of Berserk, the Godhand is the great mystery of Kentaro Miura's masterpiece. 5 humans who, when they were human, went through such suffering that it rendered their hearts open and allowed them to transcend their very humanity, became something far more sinister as a result. The Godhand is undoubtedly without peer when we talk about sheer power. They can manipulate your mind into accepting pretty much anything they're saying, cause mass waves of famine and plague with a single manifestation, birth countless monsters like ogres and trolls under the right conditions, and a couple of them can literally spend the concept of space itself. Additionally, Void is the one who performs the Invocation of Doom, the process by which a human being turns into an apostle after their chosen sacrifices have been seared with the brand of sacrifice. This in turn gives the apostles great power and resilience, and the Godhand their complete obedience. Apostles are said to be natural servants of the Godhand, to the point that they feel instinctive reverence and subservience in the presence of one. Mages refer to them as the angels of demonkind, and the Godhand seems to be directly linked to the concept of causality, the very idea of fate in Berserk, which they can seemingly perceive. Despite knowing all of this information about their awesome powers and fearful existence, we know little about why Void, Slan, Ubik, and Conrad became members of the Godhand. The only one we have concrete information on is Griffith, and the reasons for that should be obvious. Void's identity has also pretty much been decoded by us, if you've seen any of our videos on him, but we still don't know exactly what happened to him thanks to the fog of history. Still, what we know about them is bad enough for Flora, one of the strongest witches in Berserk, to tell Guts, the strongest human in Berserk, to exercise caution. As a massive body of thought that resided deep within the astral world, the Godhand were representations of deep, negative human emotions. This means that they exist everywhere and nowhere at once, and their influence on humanity can be felt all throughout the series. So far, we've seen only one way to possibly defeat the Godhand, and that too is dicey because the sword of actuation is actually a sealing weapon and not a killing weapon, and besides, it's already failed in its first attempt. Go watch our video on it to find out more. With no feasible opposition in sight and the world in a state of fantasia that allows them to spread their evil wings without restriction now, the Godhand's presence in Berserk is stronger than ever before, and that's a potential world ender, that. Elementals. After that intense first half filled with descriptions of misery and death, we feel like we need to lighten up and float in the air for a bit, quite literally. Sadly, we don't live in the Berserk verse because otherwise we'd have just taken a load off our shoulders by playing with some Barites from Helm. Elementals are tiny astral spirits that, as their name suggests, represent and embody the different elements of nature. But unlike most anime and manga series, where elementals are taken at their face value, Berserk goes to the core of the issue and uses the different states of matter to define its elementals. The wind elementals, called sylphs, actually manipulate the gaseous state of matter instead of controlling the wind. Water elementals, undines, manipulate the liquid state of being. Earth elementals, called gnomes, manipulate the solid state of being. Fire elementals, salamanders, control energy, and the aforementioned Barites are elementals that affect the concept of weight, making one's body heavier or lighter, and even producing depression or obsession in one's mind when gathered in sufficient numbers. These elementals are the reason behind the elements working the way they do in Berserk, and their powers can be harnessed through specific magical fetishes like the Sylph Cloak and Sword, the Salamander Dagger, the Axe of the Gnomes, and so on. In order to draw out an elemental's full potential, a magic user must cooperate with them and show them gratitude for their service, which strengthens their bond and makes them even more powerful as a unit later in life. Fun fact: Pixie Elves are descended from Sylphs, which technically makes Puck a wind elemental as well, something he never lets go of once he realizes it. Emperor Ganishka used astral projection to subdue thousands of Undines and Sylphs to create his gigantic mist form, which allowed him to strike his targets with lightning, which shows that you can also just straight up subdue elementals into doing your bidding. But it's better if you take the Serpico route because, well, Ganishka was a tyrant. That's how he did everything in life. Elementals are the true unsung heroes of Berserk because they put in so much work without ever being seen by the human eye. Unless you put on Shirkei's astral sensitivity cream, and then you become very real, very quick. Centaurs. These guys are kinda hard to spot if you aren't looking for them, and especially if you aren't in Helm, because centaurs seem to be exclusive to Skellig Island. Miura centaurs seem to be pretty much the same as centaurs from Greek mythology, in that they're half-human, half-horse beings. We can't comment on their personality because they don't exactly have many interactions with the cast, so we can't say if they're as rowdy or as fierce as their mythological counterparts. But what we can say is that Miura paid attention to the details when he was building the magical half of his expansive universe. If you look closely at some of the centaurs in Chapter 346, you'd have noticed that they have antlers on their heads. That's a reference to the Cyprian legend about centaurs, which records them as being similar equestrian-themed anthropomorphic beings, but sporting horns. Another thing we can assume immediately is that centaurs in Berserk are mostly good-natured, given how many of them live with the mages of Helm on Skellig Island. Indeed, the village itself is reminiscent of Camp Half-Blood, minus all the action and godly business, thanks to the centaurs we see lurking in the backdrop watching Guts and co go about their business. We're not sure if the centaurs are going to play a big role in the final arc of Berserk, but if Guts ever needs a ride that's better than the Skull Knights, then we know where he can find his cavalry. Speaking of cavalry, unicorns. These single-horned equestrians are perhaps the most well-known magical creatures of our world, to the point that they're unironically Scotland's national animal. But what Miura does best is sticking to the fundamentals when it comes to these magical beasts of antiquity. And that's exactly what he does with his unicorns. Traditionally, a unicorn is believed to be an immensely pure spiritual being that acts as a defender of the deep woods. Any encroachers are chased down by this wild creature with extreme prejudice, and their horns are said to be the source of a medicine that is immensely potent. The first time we see them in Berserk, a horde of them are running through a dense forest, and at first it seems normal. Beautiful even. That is, until you realize they're being chased by another beast that's gonna show up later in this video, and then all hell breaks loose. So far, we don't know if drinking unicorn blood gives you an extended yet cursed life, but we do know that their horns must be harvested by mages for their potions and spells because a bunch of unicorns live on Helm. We see them show up to greet Guts' party and take Ysma and Desidro for a joyride through the woods. And though elf dust does the job of unicorn horns in this series, we can't rule out its presumptive medicinal properties entirely, just because of how scarcely they're featured in the story. Unicorns, like most other astral creatures from Helm, disappeared after Griffith and his apostles destroyed the island, so we don't know when or if we'll ever see them again. But if we do, expect them to help out with that cavalry business we mentioned in our last entry, whilst probably doubling as medics during the climactic battle of Berserk. Merrows. Outside of elves, these are the only sentient magical creatures that Berserk's main characters have an extended interaction with. So let's dive straight into things. Pun very much intended. Mermaids are usually viewed with a mixed lens of tantalization and trepidation, depending on which part of the world you come from. The original mermaids, the sirens, were calculating serial killers, objectively speaking. They would sing their song melodically, lure sailors into isolated waters, and then promptly introduce said waters directly to their lungs. Over time, this myth began to be applied to mermaids as well, whom we recognize as half-human, half-fish women with killer looks and sweeter voices. While it's true that mermaids were viewed with great hesitation at one point in world history, there's no need for a sailor in the Berserk-verse to freak out when they hear angelic voices far out at sea, because chances are, these voices are trying to protect them from something they can't see. Miura drew inspiration for his mermaids from Irish folklore, and as you might have noticed already, the Irish called these creatures merrows. In Irish folklore, merrows are docile, peaceable beings with the ability to intermarry and procreate with humans. Miura adapted this into his story by giving us Isma, the half-human, half-merrow girl that Guts and co pick up on their travels aboard the Seahorse. Isma's dad was a human and her mum was a merrow, but we don't exactly know if she used a Corleen Druith to make her visits to land possible or not. In Irish folklore, the Corleen Druith, which translates to Little Magic Cap, is the vestment that keeps a merrow tethered to land with her husband and family. Isma's mom never married her dad, so there is that, and we never really see merrows carrying a hat around with them, so there's that as well. But the reason why you shouldn't worry about a merrow song is because, well, they're benevolent creatures. Merrows exist to fight evil astral creatures that dwell in the depths of the seas. They can swim as fast as a torpedo and use their divine medley to cause even the meanest of sea monsters to have a full-blown mental breakdown. Usually they wouldn't engage with humans, or even if they did, it'd mostly be for benign reasons. Sometimes a merrow will fall in love with a human, like Isma's mother, but they'll always return to the sea. Berserk doesn't place impositions on any creature's natural way of life, it just basks in the glory of their struggles. Because they're good beings, merrows can be found at Helm as well, and hybrids like Isma also possess a special ability. All astral creatures have a given name and a true name. They're usually addressed by their friends and foes by their given name, because their true names are only for them to know. If someone else were to call them by their true name, it'd give that person total control over the astral creature, so it's generally forbidden to tell anyone their true astral names unless you're ride or die for real. But in Isma's case, it also acts as an activation of sorts. If she speaks her astral name within her mind, she can activate her merrow form, and she can also deactivate by seemingly doing the same. Mermaids in Berserk will lure a sailor off his boat, yes, but they'll sing him a pretty song and kiss them goodnight before leaving them completely unharmed. And you can't say that last phrase a lot in this series. Thorns, Canunus. It was kinda hard for us to place them at first. Maybe it's because Miura drew them in such a weird fashion, or maybe it's because the Percy Jackson movies have forever ruined what a satyr looks like for us. But either way, we had to take a good hard look at these antlerless semi-doe-like creatures to confirm that they were indeed Berserk's version of fawns. Now, originally, a fawn was not at all believed to look like a satyr. Recorded as servants of the Roman god Faunus, the belief that fawns are half human and half goat is prevalent due to the infamous conflation of Greek and Roman mythologies. Again, Percy Jackson hasn't helped in this case either, because it basically shows those two mythologies as two sides of the same coin. In Greek mythology, satyrs were ribald creatures that possessed comical appendages and an insatiable thirst for indulge everything we would now look at as a vice. Girls and wine? Yes, please. And on the triple if you could, thank you. No wonder these guys were popular with Dionysus. But fans had a more, shall we say, subdued presence in Roman mythology. They were chiefly protectors of the deep woods and would intimidate men who encroached upon those woods with malign intent. They could also become guides to those who were lost within the woods, and that's about it. Berserk's fawns looked like a cross between that Roman creature and the antlered ancient Celtic god Canunus, what with their horns actually being antlers and their faces appearing more deer than goat-like. In fact, we think it's a cross between the two because we also see a few kid fawns whose horns look like goat horns in chapter 346. Either way, Berserk's fawns are definitely unique given their hybrid nature and their off-kilter appearance. It's a shame they faded away before we could see them do anything, because that would have confirmed for us which particular mythological creature inspired Miura to draw this, but we'll just move on to the next. Brownies. Who in the world can make harmless household spirits appear like sheer omens of death upon their introduction in his series? We feel like you know where we're going with this, but just look at this picture of Brownies from chapter 306, and now look at this one from chapter 347, and tell us the former didn't look like a nightmare scenario to you. But to be fair to that family, if we're just chilling in our medieval hut, and some kindred spirits who help out with household work just manifested within our living rooms and started taking care of business, we'd be shocked too. Brownies are practically the Scottish equivalent of Roman lares. They show up at your house, help you out with chores, and protect it from minor spirits in exchange for some kind of offering. In the case of brownies, this was usually cream, and if you displeased a brownie, you could expect them to leave a bigger mess than they found when they started cleaning. But Brownies aren't inherently malicious creatures, and in Berserk, they retain this role of being magical house helpers, but it's made quite literal. Brownies are first seen randomly appearing inside houses all over Midland following the great roar of the astral world, but they're mostly seen at Helm, within the great cherry blossom spirit tree, working tirelessly to keep it clean and all of its occupants happy. When Puck and Farnace's brother Magnifico are discovered trying to usurp the throne of Helm, the Flower Storm monarch sentences them to a day's service as house helps, which makes Puck exclaim that he feels like a brownie. That should let you know just how much of a threat these guys are. Most creatures on Helm are pretty much harmless and don't mean to hurt others intentionally. Well, the key word here being most. Dwarves. If you're a Disney kid, then this entry is not for you, kid, because it just might end up ruining your opinion of dwarves. Now, usually we tend to think of dwarves as tiny troubleshooters thanks to Snow White, or boastful and brash men thanks to Gimli. But every mythological and fictional adaptation about these petite-statured magical creatures agrees that they are peerless when it comes to two things: mining and crafting metal into fanciful designs and weapons. In Norse mythology especially, we find the fabled dwarven duo of Brock and Sindri, who fashioned the hammer Mjolnir for the Aesir god Thor as perhaps the most iconic divine weapon to have emerged from that pantheon. Dwarves in Norse mythology got up to all kinds of tinkering and created many a useful device for Odin and his kinsmen, and even the dwarves who helped Snow White were miners in their own right. But every depiction of dwarves almost always seems to contain within it some sort of exaggeration, be it their design, their personality, their insane creations, or something else entirely. Berserk takes the opposite route and gives its dwarves a simple role: magic blacksmith. We've only met one of them so far in the story, but this guy sure reminds us a lot of Brock from the God of War games, and reminds Guts of Godot from his Black Swordsman days. Godot might be the creator of the iconic Dragon Slayer and Guts' artificial cannon arm, but he didn't produce the item which has somehow become even more synonymous with Miura's tragic protagonist. That honor goes to Hanar. The dwarf blacksmith is the creator of both the Berserker armor and Skull Knight current armor, which houses his undead soul. And what's even more impressive than that feat is that Hanar treats both sets of armor like old friends he was happy to be rid of for life. He can instantly tell that Guts is yet to use his armor at its maximum capacity, and as the creator of the armor, he can trigger blood memories within its wearers with a single bang of his hammer. Hanar also lives in the stone forest of Helm, a region that Shirke describes as being close to Cliffarth in its aura. Not every astral creature living on Helm is all rainbows and tea cakes and joyrides galore. Some of them stick to the more ancient, more dangerous elements of Arcana, and Hanar is definitely one of them. But this isn't to say dwarves are evil. They're just rougher, more blunt with their speech and direct with their approach, kind of like the weapons they design. Wicker Man. One dark inhabitant of Helm that isn't as approachable as dwarves, however, are the Wicker Men of Skellig Island. This is because A. they can't speak, B. they're mostly inactive and need to be awakened with a spell, and C. they're literally magical scarecrows filled with sacrificed human souls. Weren't expecting that from Helm, the island utopia, were you? But it just goes to show, never judge a book by its cover. Wicker Men were part of a pagan Celtic ritual whereby druids would place living animals and humans inside of a massive wicker statue and then set it ablaze, sacrificing everything within it. It exploded into pop culture thanks to the classic 1973 horror film The Wicker Man, starring Christopher Lee. But in Berserk, the Wicker Man isn't a sacrificial effigy that's meant to get an island's harvest bounty to improve. It's actually a defense mechanism. Helm already has a utopic weather system which ensures that all crops planted on the island stay in full bloom always, all the time, so the witches of the village don't need to use Wicker Men to lure unwitting travelers to a horrifying death. The Wicker Men on Skellig Island were created 1,000 years ago, when a large army attacked the mage village of Helm and ended up paying for it with their lives. This can be presumed to be the same group that gave Danann the Viking armor, which she equips golems with, so reawakened Casca can get a bit of training done. Miura's Wicker Man is huge, as tall as a 4-story building, and as scary as the blood flow of the dead, to be honest with you, because each section of its burning body displayed the faces of the tortured souls trapped within it. Instead of palms, the Wicker Man has massive flails attached to the base of its wrists, which it can ignite and use to cause devastating damage. Guts and Co. felt the Wicker Man before they saw it because of the sheer heat and brightness coming off of its fiery body, and it would have leveled the entire field that they were fighting on had Guts not taken it down with his quick thinking. In one fluid motion, he slid underneath the Wicker Man's flails, blasted its head with his arm cannon bringing it to its knees, and then cleaving it open with one fell swoop thanks to Dragon Slayer. Though he'd stopped the Wicker Man's assault, he failed to account for the aftermath of its death, because the humongous flame puppet just fell flat on the ground and set the pumpkin field they were fighting on ablaze. It took the arrival of a great guru to deal with the situation, otherwise things might have gotten far too out of hand for Guts and Co. to deal with. They're probably the best kind of shock troops any army can employ, because as soon as the enemy takes them down, they're going to have to deal with the flames immediately, after which is a bit of a problem, to say the least. Maybe that's why there are at least half a dozen Wicker Men stored away in the stone forest, under the care of the only mage on Helm that actually looks like a witch, Granny Volvaba. They'd be a great asset to Guts and his allies in the final battle against Griffith, because you could just set important targets on fire by sicking multiple Wicker Men at them, but whether they come out to play again in the series itself remains to be seen. Goblins. Ah, yes. Our favourite cash grabbers from Clash of Clans. Our favourite bankers from Harry Potter. Our favourite troublemakers from British folklore. Yeah, that was the right one. Goblins have a varied reputation in myth and folk tales. In one of the earliest goblin stories, called the Benevolent Goblin, they were portrayed as ugly, evil-looking creatures with good intentions. That story in particular focused on the tale of a goblin who could hand out a drink to travelling knights that would remove all their fatigue and make them feel refreshed even after weeks of hard riding. This goblin's bejeweled magic cup was then stolen by a knight who was apprehended and reprimanded. His cup was given over to the King of England, and the goblin was never seen again. This initial story of a benevolent goblin then morphed into what we got in the 1971 classic tale of The Princess and the Goblin, where the titular princess gets kidnapped by the titular goblins and is only saved by a miner who knows the goblin's secret weakness, their feet. This story directly inspired Tolkien's version of the same beast for his foundational Lord of the Rings franchise, but his goblins are decidedly more evil, claimed to be adept at coming up with ingenious methods of torture, creation of devices necessary for the same, and being cruel for the sake of cruelty. These days, any creature that is short in stature, sports horrifying and pointed features, and is mischievous in nature, albeit with malice behind their intents, can be called a goblin. And that's exactly what Berserk's goblins appear to be as well. Their first appearance in Chapter 306 is in a cave, as goblins are believed to be subterranean creatures that dwell deep within the earth. Once they emerge from that cave, they set out to find some stuff to mess up and come across a human village, at which point the perspective shifts to show the other wonders and horrors that had emerged in light of the great roar of the astral world. Though we don't know what they eventually ended up doing, we can assume they harassed the ever-loving crap out of that village and possibly kidnapped and tortured a few of them as well, given that they were armed with spears and looking ready for a fight. There's the border folk tale of the infamous Red Cap Goblin, which gets its name from its brutal nature and its habit of dipping its cap in the blood of its victims, showing that killing is not off the book for the gobbers. We also see goblins near the stone forest of Elfhelm, chomping down on some fish without even scaling them, but these appear to fall in the harmless, mischievous type of goblins. You know, the kind that would knock on your door and run away, throw a pail of water at you just after you put on dry clothes, steal your cattle, that kind of stuff. It just goes to show that even with so many things inspiring him, Kentaro Miura was able to achieve a considerable degree of originality whilst creating his magical creatures. But this next one can be thought of as a straight-up rip-off. And you'll see why. Berserk Ents. In any piece of fiction these days, especially visual fiction, you'll find a lot of soft Easter eggs with maybe a smattering of a full-fledged reference, if you're lucky. But that isn't the case for these guys because upon first glance, you can tell clearly. These tree dudes are basically Berserk's version of Ents. They show up in Elfhelm's magical forest for the first time in the series, and it's clear that they're nothing like the tree that attacked Guts all the way back in Chapter 95. In fact, Berserk Ents appear to be quite like Tolkien's Ents, in that they're nature spirits. All of them look like Treebeard, and while we're not sure why they were planted, or if they have an Ent-like physiology underneath the soil, we do know that they're friendly. Just look at this guy trying to swallow Isidro's arm. Isn't he cute? It's interesting to note that Miura's Ents look like Tolkien's, but work like Martin's, in that they like animated weirwood faces with beards. Some of them have hands after reaching a certain height, but for the most part, they remain bark faces rooted firmly within the ground. Weirwoods in the Song of Ice and Fire have a deep magical and spiritual significance, as they lie at the heart of the faith of the old gods. Again, pun intended, but they seem to have a darker history than most would believe, as a Dance with Dragons hinted that the first men would make blood sacrifices to the weirwoods, which could be tasted by the green seers warging through them, which is just all kinds of creepy, if you ask us. There are many theories out there that the weirwoods are actually evil, and that the old gods aren't as benevolent as they're made to seem, but that's a discussion for another channel. As far as we know, the Berserk Ents are supposed to be more like dryads, protectors of the forest whose life forces are inherently tethered to a tree. But this isn't the only reference that Miura hides within the magical forces of his world. Everything else at Elfhelm. Most of the Elfhelm creatures we've listed here appeared in the handful of chapters that were focused on that island, but that is by no means the end of them. There were far too many magical creatures in that utopic land for us to even make out what was supposed to be the inspiration behind them. For example, there are these cloaked figures that don white masks who look a lot like No-Face from Spirited Away, if No-Face had a medieval doctor's mask instead of their poker face. Then there are these fox-like creatures that we think are supposed to be werewolves, but they just don't fit the bill quite right because they just look so cuddly. Casca, Ness, and Serpico were attended to by what appear to be elemental nymphs, but some of them are dressed like they just came back from the Renaissance fair. And then there's this frog-faced dude that looks like a cross between a golem and Guru Gedfring, but he's clearly neither, as he appears to be a living being of the non-human variety. Even in the darker underbelly of Elfhelm, we find strange creatures we talked about, the Goblins and the Dwarves, but if you look closely at the panels of Chapter 361, you'll see bizarre things like giant toads and centipedes, and a rather withered ghost-like woman carrying a leather bottle up the stony shore of the stone forest. There's also a big sea serpent-type being lurking in the waters, so clearly there's a lot going on here that we don't know and we might never know, now that Miura-sensei is gone. But if you have an inkling of what any of these are, let us know in the comments section. Trolls. These are perhaps the only magical creatures from Berserk that you can actually find in real life. Just fire up Twitter and scroll for a bit, or watch any of the TikTok content that people classify under funny videos. The currency of trolling is high these days, but back in the day, it was a term used exclusively to describe some of the most fearsome and terrifying monstrosities of myth and legend. If you've watched any of the Lord of the Rings movies or played any of the God of War games, you guys must be familiar with these lumbering behemoths that look like giants, except somehow worse. Trolls are usually depicted as mountainous and cavernous beings that live in small packs and terrify anyone daring to cross their territory. But in Berserk, they're quite different. You might mistake Miura's trolls with chimpanzees if you were to see them from behind, and that wouldn't be an incorrect analogy either, because trolls are basically chimpanzees on steroids in Berserk. They have ape-like bodies covered entirely in fur, while their heads are shaped and fanged like a rat's, and has a snout like a pig's. Multiple feeler-like protrusions come out of their head, and their watery eyes are dripping with malice, but trolls aren't quite as mindless or as clumsy as their mythological counterparts in Berserk. Neither are they quite as tall as folk-tale trolls, clocking in at about the same height as Isidro in most cases, unless you're the Troll King. What makes them terrifying is the sheer numbers they attack you with, and their barbaric way of life. Despite not possessing the ability to form speech, trolls are intelligent beings that hunt their targets in massive rampaging packs that can decimate pretty much anything in their way. They carry spiked clubs, which they can use to great effect, and a pack of trolls can easily swarm and stamp out an entire human village if the humans didn't know how to fight back properly. But what makes them so heinous is the fact that their favorite pastime seems to be kidnapping and impregnating women against their wills, until they bear them an offspring that continue the vicious cycle. The first time we see trolls emerge in the story is when Guts and Co. reach Enoch Village. The trolls had kidnapped a large number of women and children from the village and taken them off to their lair, where they spent most of their time rabidly coupling with the stolen women. Once their union had taken hold within a woman's womb, she was marked for death, for her child would claw its way out of her alien style and proceed to eat her for its first meal. The trolls also kept these ladies locked up in a pen of sorts, showing us that they did possess a degree of intelligence, but it was all in service of the most conceited acts imaginable. Hell, these guys will cannibalize their own fallen brethren if they're hungry enough if their blood is up. What keeps us up all night is thinking about what they did to those poor children we never quite found. Trolls by themselves are probably not too dangerous given that they run away from Shirke's consecrated berries like they're landmines, but given their preferred attack style and their preferred lifestyle, they're seen as the second most debauched entities in all of Berserk behind Wild himself, at least in our office. Ogres. Once again, dear viewer, we're going to have to ask you to toss out whatever you think you know about these guys straight out the window, because a Berserk ogre is nowhere near as adorable as the swamp-loving Shrek. Ogres in myth and folklore are the most repulsive of beings, and with good reason. They're typically depicted as huge, hulking monsters that live in the wilder parts of nature and feast on living beings, humans especially. Every major folktale about ogres, like Puss in Boots for example, features them in this exact role, with varying levels of intelligence and intellect across adaptations. In Japanese mythology, ogres are known as onis, horned beasts that possess a similar taste for human flesh as their Western counterparts, but with more exaggerated features like horns and fangs and three-fingered hands and such. Berserk's ogres are a mix of both of these types, we want to say, but then it's so unlike anything you've ever seen that we can't even draw a proper comparison. From the neck down, an ogre looks pretty much like a furless troll, with 3 fingers and usually wielding a massive club that they can also use as a makeshift javelin. Where things get disturbing are with its head, because you won't be able to stop thinking about the eggplant emoji after seeing it. And yes, we do mean what you think we mean. The head of an ogre in Berserk is massive and shaped like a phallus. The tip of this head is split vertically for some reason, and the ogre's snout-like nose lies above its ocular apparatus. Their eyes are located on their side of the tip of their heads, and beneath it lay a hideous mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth, with 2 tusks emerging from either side of it. An ogre's nose lets out steam when it's ticked off, and ticking it off is a terrible idea, given that it can crush you with a single move, and you won't be able to do much about it. Their resilience is on par with some of the strongest apostles, as an ogre can keep fighting even after incurring devastating injuries. Guts disarmed the first ogre he fought and even cut it open from belly to torso, but it was all to no avail, as the ogre reattached its arm and open wounds and simply shrugged off the trolls trying to get a quick snack in. In fact, what saved the Black Swordsman party on that particular occasion was Shirkei's water magic, whereby she used a powerful nature spirit's assistance to literally wash away every evil astral creature in the vicinity of Enoch Village. Guts managed to land a parting blow with Dragon Slayer that decapitated the ogre's phallic head, but even he knew it was just compensatory. The only 2 characters that have been shown to have dealt with an ogre efficiently are the Apostle Borkov, who kills and devours an apostle within Pandemonium under the pretext of training, and Skull Knight, who turned multiple ogres into meat cubes when he arrived in Cliffoth. Considering which side of causality you lie on, ogres are either the greatest blessing from the supreme idea or your worst nightmare if you ever come across them, and we lie in the latter category. Cliffoth creatures. This entry is being made because, just like Elfhelm, there were many bizarre creatures in Cliffoth that we can't quite explain or relate to any mythical creatures from our world. Some of the nightmarish beasts include a brain with a human face and spider legs to walk on, a toad-like creature with the face of a man, a slug-like penile creature with an eye in the middle of the shaft and a mouth at the tip, multiple squirming critters that were shaped like sperms with a single eye in their middle, the anti-ent that looks like a demonic spider residing at the base of a tree, and the many fungi that possess both ears and eyes. None of these creatures have ever been recorded in any kind of history, which suggests that they're original creations. And just as well, because if we saw a phallic slug with a human mouth coming towards us, even with non-hostile intent, we'd probably squish it dead, just out of pure fear. If you guys think you can name any of the inspirations behind these creatures, well, we look forward to your comments down in the comments section. But just for now, just know that this list would have probably had a dozen more entries had we known the names of all these creatures. Daka. These guys are probably the only other magical beings on this list apart from the Apostles and their Hellspawn that have the power of evil running through their veins. The Daka were a group of demonic soldiers created by the Dread Emperor Ganishka to aid in his global conquest. The reason we call them demonic soldiers is because they were born with the essence of evil already within them, though Ganishka's sorcerers didn't achieve this by any conventional means. See, usually you'd have to use a behelit to allow the idea of evil's power to surge through you. Pseudo Apostles are endowed with that power by their apostle masters, who share some of that essence with their spawns, so it works out. Daka are born from human women, and their moment of birth is pretty similar to a troll being born in the Berserk verse. So, how exactly do they get this power of evil? By being soaked in it as fetuses. Ganishka has his top sorcerer General Daiba create something known as the man-made behelit, a monstrous apparatus made out of the stitched-together bodies of living apostles and filled with amniotic fluid. When a woman was lowered within this behelit, the fluid which carried the essence of evil from the linked interiors of the apostle's body corrupted the child growing within her and mutated into this demonic beast. Daka soldiers are all dark-skinned, horned and fanged, but you can see they're still children in truth by the way Miura draws their sad, beady eyes. Ganishka's sorcerers capture the newborn demon babies, put them in cages, feed them a steady diet of their own mothers, and raise them up to become fierce warriors that replace the need for human soldiers entirely. The saddest thing is, the Daka are basically fodder in front of Griffith's reborn band of the Falcon, which means that this whole horrific creation process was ultimately done for nothing. We classify the Daka as magical creatures because of what we've just told you, but also because when they die, their bodies revert to their normal human form, much like what happens at the moment of an apostle or a pseudo-apostle's death. It's just a shame that unlike those guys, the Daka truly have no choice in living the lives they've been given. Pashaka. These guys are the other half of Ganishka's nocturnal army of magical monsters, and one can even argue that they lie at the heart of his military strategies. The term Pashaka in Hindu mythology refers to shape-shifting fiends that delight in tormenting traveling humans. In Berserk, Pashaka are familiars created by hosting a spirit within an animal's body. They're made and controlled by Kushan sorcerers. with lead wizard Diber overseeing all of their deployment. There are 4 types of Pashaka shown in the series, and each of them seem to have a specific purpose. The first type we see are the Elephant Pashakas, who charge out of Ganishka's demon castle of Wyndham to meet Griffith's war demon Lancer unit in battle. The sight of a regular elephant would terrify the ever-loving crap out of any normal person, so you can imagine the sheer terror a bipedal, armored and armed elephant would generate. And Ganishka has scores of them. The second type is the Crocodile Pashaka. These reptilian fields are bipedal as well, lightly armored on occasion, and carry harpoons attached to their hands that act as their primary weapons. Crocodile Pashaka were key to Ganishka's overnight subjugation of the entire shoreline of Ritanis. And yes, you heard us right, they subdued an entire coast in a single night. They also serve as patrolmen in the occupied Wyndham city, and are especially effective at reconning through the sewers for obvious reasons. Another patrolling Pashaka entity is the Tiger Pashaka, which prowls the streets at night looking to straddle anybody that wanders into it to an early and grisly demise. Tiger Pashakas are massive, much larger than their mammalian counterparts, with fanged teeth and excellent value as a shock unit. They can also double as cavalry for the Daka, which would frankly be a horrifying sight to behold if we ever saw it in person. And the final Pashaka is the abominable sea beast, the Makara, a familiar created by taking over the ethereal body of a blue whale. A Makara spouts an elephantine trunk after being possessed and gained the ability to fight both on land and sea. A single Makara has the ability to sink 10 warships by itself. And to just give you guys some perspective on how insane that fact is, Guts' 100-man stand would need to be repeated at least 10 times over to even start matching up to this kind of a kill count. When a Pashaka dies, its body reverts to its original state quite like an apostle's, which is why we count them in our magical creatures list. There are 2 ways to deal with a Pashaka. You can butcher them or take out the sorcerers controlling them for a cleaner victory. But either way, if you let them run rampant, it'll mean certain death for you and your loved ones. Headless Knight. This one is a sort of a blink and you'll miss it kind of deal because this guy literally shows up in a single panel in the entire series. But the myth of a headless knight galloping through the streets of a city looking for said head has been prevalent in European and American folklore. In Irish folklore, there's a malevolent spirit known as a Godhand. This spirit manifests as a wild rider astride a black horse, holding its own head in its hands and wielding a whip that's actually a human spine taken from a corpse. When a Godhand stops riding, a death is inevitable, and that death is usually of the person whose name the Godhand speaks after coming to a halt. There's a variant of this folktale called the Headless Coachman, in which a similar spirit, clad in all black, travels down a street at night in a coach pulled by 6 headless horsemen. The first proper literary reference to a headless knight comes from the Arthurian legend of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and the character type was solidified in the mainstream by Washington Irving's iconic tale, The Legend of the Sleepy Hollow, which also serves as the inspiration behind the 1999 Tim Burton cult classic Sleepy Hollow. Most Headless Horseman, Headless Knight stories either show the horseman looking for its missing head or carrying it with him in an effort to curse someone else with the death it can't seem to achieve. Don't listen to nearly headless Nick about the glories of being a Headless Horseman, because there's a reason he's nearly headless. In Berserk, the tale of the Headless Knight seems to have been adapted pretty much as is, as Miura's Headless Knight is nothing but a hollow suit of armor with a metal shield that's shaped like a helmet visor, which could have been part of that armor if it had a head to begin with. The knight shows up in the middle of a town, lance, couche and shield at the ready as crowds of unwitting people run away from it in terror. Naturally, considering this guy didn't have a friggin' head, but the Headless Knight's existence is a good reference point for how Miura built his world. Not only were important iconic mythological creatures given importance, iconic folktales have just as much weight and importance in terms of their astral existence in Berserk, because, at the end of the day, all these creatures on this list exist only because humans believe in their existence. That's a story for another video. But now that we've spoken out about one Headless Knight, let's talk about another that's in a similar vein to this guy. Loch Ness Monster. Good old Nessie pops her head out of a musty Loch for about the same time as the Headless Knight from the previous entry, but it's enough to give you an idea of just how much inspiration Miura drew from European myth and folklore for his own story. The Loch Ness Monster is perhaps the most famous cryptid in modern history, with multiple people claiming to have verifiable proof of its existence, including that famous picture a surgeon took in 1934, which has since been debunked as a hoax. Accounts vary regarding Ness's appearance, or even what she does in the Loch in the first place, but all agree that she's abnormally large. Some call her a cross between a whale and a fish, whilst others portray her as a plesiosaur. But no one actually knows why she's become so famous. Maybe it's Ness's sheer size of the fact that the earliest stories about the Loch Ness Monster show it dragging humans underwater, with the sole purpose of consuming them. Whichever it is, it's clear that Miura stopped at the legends and came up with Ness's design himself, because his Loch Ness Monster equivalent looks nothing like what you might imagine. In the same chapter where we see the Headless Knight, chapter 306, we also see a small panel that shows a few boys boys taking a bath in a lake. Near a cluster of branches that are hanging low over the lake, the crown of a shaggy beast emerges from the lake. It looks immensely furry and has protrusions that look like horns dotting the surface of its head. One of the kids is pointing in its direction as the others are looking toward him, which gives you a clear idea of what's happening in that scene. Right after the great roar of the astral world, many magical beasts just popped into existence with no warning, and these boys were about to learn that the hard way. Nessie might be an old chum to many of you watching the video right now, given how long she's been in popular memory, but Miura takes her back to her roots as a ruthless and savage sea beast, and we appreciate him for that. Harpies. Imagine you're just chilling in the countryside, minding your own business, plowing your fields, and then suddenly a flying rooster with a monster's claws and a woman's head carries you off to her lair and doesn't even explain why she's doing what she's doing. That's pretty much how an encounter with a harpy would go in our opinion. These half-woman, half-bird creatures have a varied origin story. Some tales claim they were created by Zeus, some claim Poseidon or Pontus and Gaia made them, while others named Thaumas and Electra as their parents. They were originally supposed to be wind spirits, then they were blind king Phineus's tormentors, and nowadays they're believed to be one of the many guardian beasts of the Greek underworld. But nearly all accounts agree that the Harpies were a vicious bunch who were not really pleasing to look at. And Berserk continues that trend with its own interpretation of a Harpy. Miura's version of a Harpy possesses the wings, tail, and talons of a large bird of prey, while its bodice and its face is reminiscent of a woman. Their heads are covered by a mane, and their teeth and fanged and numerous, in order to allow them to bite into their prey easier. In the story of King Phineus's torment, it's said that Zeus cursed Phineus with blindness after the ruler used his prophetic powers to reveal taboo information to humanity. He then put Phineus on an island and laid out a buffet in front of him, but cursed him with the Harpies, who would steal his food the moment he reached his table and eat it themselves in some versions or waste it on the ground to torment him further in others. Phineus was eventually saved by the arrival of Jason and the Argonauts to the island, where the Harpies were finally dealt with by the son of the North Wind, whose lineage was prophesied to take down these malevolent keepers since long ago, according to the Argonautica. In Berserk, though, there's no such protection for the average human because 1. The Harpies are actually malevolent creatures in this story, and 2. There are far more than just 2 or 3 of them. Harpies are a race of creatures in Berserk, and their raids on human villages can be perceived as the aerial version of what trolls do, minus the violation. They're just as restless and ruthless as their other, darker astral counterparts, and that makes them not friendly by default. Taking down a Harpy is relatively easy, as Rickert proved with his rapid-fire machine crossbow on his way to Falconia. But if you don't have special equipment like him or a bunch of accurate archers in your party, you're in for a rude journey to paradise, my friend. So, our advice for the road is, if you hear screeching, duck and cover unless you want to get carried off to your demise. That's also true for the next creature on our list, just not in the flight department. Cockatrices. A literal murder rooster was probably the last thing you thought you're gonna see on this list when you clicked on it. Yet, here we are. A cockatrice is a Gorgonesque being from British folklore and myth, which famously boasts the features of both a dragon-like reptile and the titular cock, aka a rooster. Cockatrices were feared creatures in the Middle Ages, so much so that there were accurate descriptions on how they were created and what you could use to defeat them in medieval bestiaries. A cockatrice was allegedly born from a cock egg, which was hatched by a deaf adder, or a donkey according to E.R. Edison in his high fantasy novel The Worm of Ouroboros, published in 1922. Before Edison's novel caught on, cockatrices were believed to look like half-dragons or wyverns, with a rooster's head and feet. After this novel, the rooster elements of a cockatrice began being focused on more heavily by fantasy authors, though there is a precedent for it in heraldry and coats of arms like that of the Royal Air Force's No. 3 Squadron. As for a cockatrice's abilities, it's said to be able to kill its target with a single stare, or by breathing upon them. To defeat a cockatrice, the best thing one could do apparently was show it its own reflection to turn its death stare on itself, or expose it to a rooster's crowing to put an end to its rampage. Only a weasel was said to be immune to a cockatrice's stare, and we're pretty sure at one point people also believed they breathed fire. In Berserk, a cockatrice is exactly what we called it at the beginning of this entry, a murder rooster. It's a massive rooster-like being with teeth adorning its beak and a serpentine tail extending out of its rear. It can breathe out a poisonous fume that can incapacitate humans and animals alike, allowing it to snap up its meals with terrifying efficiency. The one cockatrice we've seen so far was only put down thanks to the arrival of the Apostle Irvine, because every arrow shot in its direction before he came was being blown away by its poisonous breath, quite literally. Irvine's special arrow skewered the cockatrice's head, which killed it in an instant, but there's no telling how the human soldiers of that band of the Falcon Rescue Unit could have squared up to it without his help. Dragons. For over 200 chapters, every Berserk fan worth their salt had a single question on their minds. When will we see Guts slay an actual dragon with his Dragon Slayer? In Godot's explanation montage regarding the sword's existence, we see a panel depicting a dragon's head butchered by his iconic creation, but that's more of a what it's supposed to do rather than what it's done kind of scenario. In fact, the only dragon we see Guts use his massive sword against is not even a dragon, because Grunbeld is, first and foremost, an apostle. His dragon form is merely a representation of what he thought his ideal self should look like, and the fact that he has corundum skin and can't fly already makes him an imposter as far as those magical reptiles are concerned. Curiously enough, Miura seems to have taken the Martin route instead of hanging right on Tolkien Avenue when he was coming up with the design for his dragon. So far, the influence of European and British folklore on his work has been evident, but when it came to dragons, he made a curious distinction. For his fake dragon, Miura gave him the classic dragon features: 4 legs, fire breathing, all that jazz. No wings, because flying, given Grunbeld's weight and size, would just be a bad idea. But his apostle design is more in line with your traditional depiction of a dragon. Miura's actual dragon looks pretty much like a cross between a Targaryen dragon and Tyson's Bit Beast from Beyblade. This bipedal monstrosity pops up from out of nowhere, right after the great roar of the astral world, and perches itself atop a tower. The sight of the dragon was enough to make everyone in the vicinity run for the hills, but if you just look at it in isolation, it's a majestic creature. Even in black and white, you can tell this dragon's scales were gleaming in the sun in all caps. And it's that kind of detailing that makes Miura one of the greatest manga artists of all time. We call it a Martinesque dragon because of the way the dragon uses its forearms, aka its wing claws, to maneuver itself up that tower. Scroll down a couple of pages from where you see this beast appear in chapter 306, and you'll see an entire valley full of flying dragons. So, at the very least, Guts won't have to look too far to properly christen his iconic blade with its given name. The real question is, how will killing a dragon fit into the storyline? But we're sure Studio Gaga will figure something out. After all, they managed to do it with its Greek counterpart, and yes, that is a segue for the next entry. Hydra. This one should be pretty much self-explanatory. It's a giant frigging snake dragon with nearly a dozen heads. The Lernaean Hydra is famous, or rather infamous, for being one of Hercules' failed labors as part of the 12 labors myth. If you don't know about it, Hercules was supposed to perform 10 impossible tasks for King Eurystheus, his cousin, in order to repent for his unintentional slaying of his own wife and children. Out of all the tasks assigned to him, Hercules failed 2 of them on technicalities, and so his 10 labors are remembered as 12 instead. One of the failed labors is interchangeably named as either his hunting of the Stymphalian birds or his cleaning of the Aegean stables, given that he took help in either instance depending on who the chronicler was. But all accounts agree that Hercules was not given the mission passed screen message when he took down the Lernaean Hydra, arguably his most iconic enemy from those 12 labors, and the one that became most useful to him as well. The Hydra was an aquatic life form that dwelt at Lake Lerna, and Hercules was sent to wipe it out. He quickly realized that using traditional methods against this beast was not going to be helpful at all, as if you chop off one of the Hydra's heads, 2 more appear in its place. Because Hercules used the help of either a male companion or his nephew, again, accounts differ, his defeat of the Hydra, the unkillable menace of Lerna, was discounted from the final tally. Still, Hercules was able to get himself some pretty useful poison arrows by dipping his in the Hydra's blood, which is supposedly one of the most venomous substances out there. Berserk's version of a Hydra is neither as extravagant or as useful after its death to the person who kills it. It's simply vicious. A huge serpentine creature that slithers across forests, trampling trees with its massive belly. The Hydra is more like the Shesh Nagar from Hindu mythology, except it doesn't possess those iconic hoods most associated with that ancient serpent. These are just a dozen angry snakeheads that first show up chasing unicorns out of the forest and into the countryside. In chapter 356, we learn that the Hydra has been tamed by one of the groups opposing Griffith's utopian capital of Falconia, and at first it appears just as indestructible as the myths have made it out to be. Nosferatu Zod himself is the first person to engage it in battle, but as soon as Zod strikes off one head, 2 more appear. This particular Hydra was killed off quickly because no sooner had it hit the regen button that Irvine riddled it with his special arrows and then Grunbeld burnt it to a crisp, reducing the Hydra to nothing more than ashes. Clearly, Miura gave his Hydra a massive nerf in terms of its durability, but we don't really mind that because the impact and the visual did justice to the development. But now let's talk about the beings that are so strong that they managed to tame this Hydra we've been talking about for a minute. Giants. From Greek mythology to Jack and the Beanstalk, the legends of bloodthirsty and brutish giants populating our planet have been told multiple times over across various regions and religions. In Greek mythology, they were the children of Gaia who tried to overthrow the gods after the Titans failed. In Norse myth, they were the abominable frost giants who were the All-Father's arch-nemesis. In Jack and the Beanstalk, the giant was more of a traditional fairy tale guardian monster type figure, as it was always guarding the golden eggs. In Berserk, there's no such mindfulness in the giants. They're just plain, humongous savages with a taste for human flesh. Miura named his giants Jotuns, after the giants from Nordic myths, but he seems to have based their design after Gaia's offspring. His giants don't possess ice-based powers or abilities, but they are massive, with one of them using the roof of a home as a helmet and visor. Several giants are seen using parts of buildings as makeshift armor in Chapter 356, and their treatment of human beings is arguably worse than that of apostles. Not only do they kill them, they then mutilate their bodies to make grisly displays out of flayed skins and skeletons, and wear ornaments created from the bones of their enemies. A regular human is about as big as a giant's maw, so you can imagine just how much of a chance you would have stood against even one of them. And these guys aren't the only type of giant in the series either. In Chapter 306, we see a massive figure, larger than a hill, lumber out of a forest and happen upon a duo of unsuspecting farmers. This creature was covered from head to toe in fur that also hid its eyes, and it carried a gigantic club on its shoulders. Its design is different enough from the Jotuns for us to comfortably say it's a different kind of giant, and our best guess is that this dude is either Miura's version of a Sasquatch or a Yeti. We lean toward the former, given the area it emerges from, but you get our point. While the Sasquatch was different from its Norse-inspired counterparts, it'd probably be in your best interest to avoid interacting with it as you go about your business in Fantasia, because you never know what kind of day it might be having. Depending on its mood and hunger, you could either become best friends with him or end up on his dinner table, and the latter option is your only option with the Jotuns. But these behemoths aren't the only things inspired from Nordic myths. Sea dragons. There are many sea serpents or dragons that populate the realm of myth and fantasy alike. In Game of Thrones, we hear tales about the Grey King who fought the sea dragon Nagar and made a great haul out of its bones. In Norse myth, we learn about the world serpent Jormungandr, who's so long that his entire body covers the earth from end to end, and which causes it to bite its own tail. It's said that when the world serpent lets go of its own tail, the fabled battle of Ragnarok will break out, and that shall be the twilight of the gods. In Christianity, we find the fiendish sea serpent Leviathan, and in ancient Mesopotamia, a serpentine sea goddess called Tiamat was worshipped as the primordial creator of all things. In Berserk, sea dragons don't play a large spiritual role in that they're simply magical beasts of the sea. We see one of them pop up when Shirka goes to take an astral tour of the world from aboard the Seahorse following the Great Roar, but we get a good look at more of them in Chapter 327, which deals with the felling of another sea creature whom we'll discuss in just a moment. Berserk sea dragons look like a cross between piranhas and sea serpents, as some of them bear a more fish-like appearance whilst others look like Chinese dragons, except they're under the sea. They feed on whatever they can find lying dead and rotting within the ocean, and hunt when they don't find such feed, implying that they're primarily scavengers. Sea dragons are a major cause for concern for sailors in Fantasia, especially around sea battles because the blood attracts them like shark to chum. When traveling by sea in Fantasia, it's best to avoid conflicts and bloodied waters as much as possible, because you never know just where a sea dragon might be lurking. But as bad as these guys are, what's worse is the sea creature we mentioned a few moments ago. Sea God. From this point forward, we're going to be discussing higher magical creatures of Berserk. You know, the guys that transcend the boundary of reason even within the realm of fantasy. Like this giant Cthulhu-looking guy. The sea god is an ancient, malevolent sea deity that dwelt at a cave near the island Izmir was born on. Since time immemorial, the inhabitants of the island prayed to it over seeking to harmonize with the Meros of the surrounding sea out of pure fear, and this continued even after the Meros had forced the sea god to retreat to his astral abode. Following the great roar of the astral world, his body was brought back to the physical world, and he began exerting his evil influence over all the sea life that went as far as his tentacle beard did. And that stuff went far, man. His tentacles were also not just regular attack tentacles because they possessed the disgusting added bonus of making whatever organic life they consumed a part of the sea god's overall body and will. So, these people and animals would return to life as horrifying fish-like beings capable of transforming into tentacle monsters at will, like the pirate Bonebeard and his crew, or everyone at Izmir's island that wasn't Izmir herself. But what's even more bizarre is the fact that these tentacles were simply a part of this abomination's beard. Though we never actually see it in its full glory, the sea god's full body size must have been equal to that of Emperor Ganishka's when he became the twice reincarnated destroyer Shiva, because its head was well above the ocean water while its feet touched the ocean bed. That's right, just let that sink in. The killer tentacles were just the underbrush adorning a massive island-sized maw, which itself was situated at the base of a huge dome-like head. The only way Guts defeated this guy was by making it to its heart, and even that nearly killed him because the sea god, like any living organism, had its own natural defense systems. And when those kicked in, Guts could only rely on his battle skills and Shirka's guidance for victory. In the end, he pierced the sea god's heart with Dragon Slayer, which caused the beast to literally deflate into the sea. But this also ended up trapping him inside of it. If it hadn't been for the Merrows and the Moonlight Boy, Berserk's protagonist would have been declared dead at sea in Chapter 327, but thankfully that wasn't the case. The Sea God is a great example of not just how powerful top-tier astral entities can be, it's also a reminder that the world used to have to face horrors like this on a regular basis 1,000 years ago, when magic was at its peak. But to counteract the malevolence of these vicious bestial deities, there also existed good magical spirits, and the next few entries are going to focus on those guys. Lady of the Depths. Just as there are bad spirits and evil creatures in Berserk, there are also good spirits and benevolent creatures, and this lady is one of them. Before the great roar of the astral world, most of the continent of man was dominated by a single religion, that of the Holy See. This monotheistic pseudo-Christian faith was built upon a hard oppression of magic and all its practitioners, with its churches being built upon shrines dedicated to other nature spirits to eradicate the latter's presence. The shrine of the Lady of the Depths was located underneath one such church, situated in the heart of Enoch village. The lady is a powerful astral being that represents the spirit of the rill running through the village. She's quite like a water spirit or nymph from Greek mythology, and is reminiscent of Salacia and the Inuit river goddess Sedna. Shirka manifests her spirit and powers by performing a ritual Evalera dubs possession. By communing with the Lady of the Depths through her luminous body, she is able to access her unbridled powers, which end up washing away the astral creatures besieging Enoch village in a violent torrent. Once this was done, Shirka had to be snapped out of her trance because she'd allowed the lady's spirit to mingle with hers on too intimate a level, which is one of the hazards of communing with powerful astral spirits. The Lady of the Depths is undoubtedly one of the strongest benevolent beings we've seen pop up in the story, and as long as the residents of Enoch Village keep faith in her through the small shrine they decided to dedicate to her following the troll incident, she'll watch over them with all her might. Rotting Root Lord. Elemental spirits are only as strong as the elements within which they reside. This means that water spirits will be stronger near water, earth spirits when in the ground. You get the gist. Out of all the different kinds of elemental spirits that exist, however, the one that a mage must guard themselves most against is a spirit of darkness, because the darkness was just as likely to consume them as it was to help them out. This is what makes Shirka's taming of the Rotting Root Lord so impressive, because in the short time between stopping the troll raid and entering Cliffoth, she'd managed to steel herself into summoning and effectively using a being that was arguably even more powerful than the Lady of the Depths. The Rotting Root Lord is an earthen spirit that looks reminiscent of Swamp Thing, but instead of hating the rot, it brings the rot with itself. When Shirka completes her pact with the Rotting Root Lord, she could cause astral beings to decompose into nothing by simply uttering the word rot. The Root Lord's power also came in handy to her when she entered the Corridor of Dreams, as it was one of the magical artifacts that helped her and Ness restore all the pieces of Casca's shattered sanity. Though it has a considerably small amount of screen time dedicated to it, the Rotting Root Lord is definitely one of the most unique and badass astral spirits we see across the series. Still, it can't hold a candle to the next guy on our list, and we do say that in a semi-literal sense. Wheel of Flames. This is probably the most impressive nature spirit Shirka has managed to summon and commune with, for the simple fact that it's a literal blazing wheel of fire. The Wheel of Flames resided within the harbour of Vritanis, a holy seaport city which must have been the site of 100,000 battles in the past. It's a warrior spirit, for it claims to be the hellfire that scorches and burns the battlefield after the fact. It manifested as a massive fiery wheel in motion which proceeded to mow down every Darka and Pishaka that was standing on that harbour in less than a minute. In fact, Guts had to grab Shirka and Isidro and dash them off to safety because the Wheel of Flames was such a strong spirit that its flames might have burnt them all to a crisp. What's even more impressive is the fact that unlike the Root Lord or the Lady of the Depths, the Wheel of Flames can actually be used in combat by someone who isn't communing with it, and you guys should already know where we're going with this. During his epic showdown with Emperor Ganishka's wizard general Daiba, Guts combines the Wheel of Flames with his berserker armor and the Dragon Slayer to turn himself into an unstoppable cannonball that blazes its way through a laser-sharp spout of water capable of cutting entire ships in half. He uses the fiery abilities of the wheel to negate the Undines and cuts down his target with precision, but the cost to his body is immense. He's battered and burnt after taking such a high risk, and you can tell he never wants to repeat that particular mad idea ever again just by looking at him. The Wheel of Flames also assists Shirka and Ness when they traverse through Casca's broken mindscape by burning the mock apostles trying to attack them into a fine crisp. We hope that by the end of the story, Shiurka can become powerful and experienced enough to pull some kind of combination of these three nature spirits she's communed with to form some kind of astral megazord, but that's wishful thinking. But Shiurka too thought that getting to see her mistress after her death was wishful thinking. She was proven wrong, and so might we. And speaking of Flora... That's right, folks. Flora is a full-fledged magical being now. At the time of her death, Berserk's most skilled mage was an old woman who had lived well past her allotted time on Earth. As such, she was unable to even defend herself against Griffith's apostles, and she simply resigned her physical body to the flames that engulfed her spirit tree mansion. But her astral body changed its form and transcended the mortal boundaries between life and death by turning Flora into a daemon. After her death, Flora manifested as a massive wall of flames that even the flame dragon knight Grunbeld could not pass through, and her face looked like what it must have looked like back when she was young. We thought it was just a last gasp burst of magic kind of thing, until we met Flora in the Corridor of Dreams. Turns out her spiritual body had turned into a higher elemental spirit called a daemon, which is far stronger than the Lady of the Depths, the Rotting Root Lord, or the Wheel of Flames. Daemons in Berserk can be the remnants of humans and mages alike, and they're considered to be extremely powerful guiding spirits that reside in the deeper layers of the astral world. Communion with daemons is a high privilege amongst the sorcerers of Helm, and the fact that Flora became one after her death is just proof of her magical prowess in life. So far, we haven't seen any of her new kin, given that Helm was blown up only recently, but we're sure that before Berserk is over, we'll see a few more daemons come out to play. We just have to be patient for it. Kundalini. When this gigantic water serpent showed up in the series, we wondered two things. One, where in the hell did it come from? And two, how in the hell did nobody notice it? The term Kundalini is a reference to the purported locked potential that dwells at the base of every human being's spine, according to certain Hindu sects. This potential is often represented as a coiled serpent that's located near the groin of a human, and once this potential is awakened, it's said that a person unlocks their full awareness potential as a human being and can perceive the path to salvation and a higher existence. In Berserk, the Kundalini is a much simpler yet more lethal kind of beast. It's a highly powerful spiritual serpent. The actual body of the Kundalini resembles that of a medium-sized serpent, albeit one that is luminous given its great astral energy. The massive form that the Kundalini assumes in Chapter 272 is thanks to its inherent power over the water elementals, which makes it particularly brutal in the sea, which is where Guts & Co. happen to be fighting its master, Diber. The Wizard General seems to have tamed the Kundalini with a series of spells, mantras and hand gestures, because he uses an incantation to reveal the full body of the strongest weapon in his arsenal. The Kundalini's command over the Undines was such that it could create massive water geysers like it was nothing, and spout out those ship-splitting laser-like beams of water we were talking about earlier. Diber's usage of its abilities make them a formidable duo, and the only reason the Kundalini was even defeated was because Guts took a mortal risk. See? Within its aqueous body, the tiny mortal self of the Kundalini has room to swim away from danger whenever it approaches. This makes the beast very hard to kill, so Guts decided to evaporate its protection from the Wheel of Flames and expose it to his Dragon Slayer. It worked out, although it did leave every muscle in his body aching, according to Guts, because he spent his entire time fending off tornadoes and fighting with a gaping hole in his chest, which was only patched up by the crude needlework of the Berserker armor. Had his quick thinking and Shirka's Wheel of Flames not been present in the series, we might not have a Berserk to talk about today, because the Kundalini is just that damn strong. But despite its off-the-scale powers and difficult-to-kill body, there are a few beings who rank even higher than this spiritual abomination. Four Kings of the World. Every elemental creature or spirit that we've mentioned in this video, be it the Undines, Sylphs, Salamanders, Gnomes, Ladies, Root Lords or Fiery Wheels of Flames, is but a manifestation of the elements that they most resonate with. All elements in the Berserkverse are governed by four unseen yet all-powerful kings whose jurisdiction runs across the globe. The King of the North is the ruler of air and all air elementals. The King of the West is the ruler of the Undines and water spirits. The King of the East is the ruler of the Salamanders and the blazing fires of the earth, and the King of the South is the ruler of the Gnomes and all things that make up the very earth itself. The four kings of the world are recorded in Holy See Scripture as the four cardinal angels of their faith, while the practitioners of Arcana know them as the benevolent protectors of all mankind. The four kings thus become only the second place where beliefs of the mages and the Holy See overlap, the first being the prophecy of the Falcon, which pretty much predicted Griffith's rebirth as Femto. Unlike the Angel of Longing, however, these four elemental rulers do not seek to rule over or subjugate people underneath an iron fist, no matter how shiny that fist might look. Instead, they support humans, and this is most evident through the formation of the Four, one of the most basic magical spells that an Elfhelm mage learns. The formation of the Four is quite simple, yet its power is very effective when a skilled caster summons it. Once summoned, any evil astral entity that tries to enter the formation would be eviscerated in a matter of seconds, making the Four Kings one of the strongest magical entities in Berserk, period. As of this moment in the story, we've never heard them speak, and we've never even seen their actual forms, although Chapter 362 might have something to say about that. But best believe, before everything is said and done, we'll find out some kind of terrifying secret about the Four Kings and their powers that will make them appear more as a necessary evil than as benign elemental overlords. And you'll be thanking us for this video when that day arrives. Skull Knight. Oh, you didn't know that the Skull Knight was a magical creature? Well, strap in lads, because this will be short and rather mind-bending if you still haven't figured out who the guy behind the skull helmet is supposed to be. Skull Knight is basically the deceased vengeful soul of King Geyserik, which has been bound to this skeletal armor by the craftsmanship of Hanar. He's immensely powerful, possesses insight into the flow of causality, and rides a majestic steed that can both gallop and fly at speeds that are unnatural today, let alone the medieval age. But the primary factor that allows us to classify the Skull Knight as a magical creature is the fact that he only seems to manifest on full moons. From his very first appearance to his latest appearance, every time we've seen Skull Knight, it's either been a full moon or a temporal junction point is about to reach critical mass. Either way, it's bad news for everyone else, and great news for Skull Knight, because he gets to show off his knowledge and sword skills in front of an audience that can actually understand and appreciate it. Not that he's doing it for validation, mind you. He just wants to kill the Godhand. And speaking of the Godhand, he also went and fashioned for himself a magical blade called the Sword of Actuation, which is made out of the behellets he's been processing inside of himself that he then coats on his regular thorny sword. Yep, Mystery Knight with a magical sword trope. Check, check, and check. Skull Knight's destiny seems to be headed toward a magical conclusion as well, as the only time we see him showing up again is when the story has another full moon by accident or when it reaches its climax, because God forbid Studio Gaga and Kujimori spend some time elaborating on the backstory of one of Berserk's most iconic characters. But we're getting off topic here. Point is, Skull Knight is as much of a magical being as Schnoz is, and we're just going to let that sink in while we talk about the last entity on our list. Idea of Evil. Literally everything that has happened so far in Berserk, except for the minor leaps made by Guts and his party when flowing with the currents of causality, has been planned, controlled and manipulated by a giant floating heart that resides in the middle of the abyss and is covered in ice for some reason. That's right. The idea of evil is the ultimate magical being in all of Berserk, and it's poetic irony that it was born only because humans subconsciously willed it into existence. We desired reasons for our suffering, justifications to make them softer on ourselves, and diversions that we could blame things on instead of taking matters into our own hands. We needed things like fate and a destiny to adhere to, so we could gauge our own progress on the path of supposed righteousness. The idea produces the reasons for those sufferings, and it does so through three main agents: causality, behellets, and the Godhand. Causality is the flow of fate in the world of Berserk. Every person's fate has already been determined by the idea, which acts like a sister of fate and keeps spinning those threads to produce more terrible reasons for humans to cling to life. Behellets find the agents that are worthy of perpetuating the idea's debauched life motto of doing as one pleases, without giving a single thought to the concept of morality, and the Godhand acts as agents of the idea's will, helping things flow into the direction that it intends for the world. So far, this is the only mystery in the series that doesn't have any clear-cut theories, because it's practically impossible to guess what the idea truly desires of the world. We know it will probably include some kind of confrontation between Guts and Griffith, and that a sacrificial ritual might be involved given how many people Griffith has penned up in Falconia, but that's about it. Everything else about this entity and its goals for the Berserkverse remains a mystery, and that's kind of what makes the idea the strongest magical creature in existence. It just chills in the bottom of the pit named Hell, churning out fates and despair like it was an assembly line at a Ford factory in the 20th century. Just where these cars are headed and why, we do not know for a fact yet, and this is the only time that we'll be glad to stay in the dark. Knowledge is power, sure, but knowledge is also terror. And we think knowing what the idea of evil has in store for the inhabitants of the Berserkverse is going to be giving us sleepless nights aplenty. Marvelous verdict. And with that happy thought in our heads, we finally come to an end of this massive list of every magical creature and being in Berserk. Let us know which ones were your favorites, which ones you hated, and which ones we missed in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more marvelous content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.